So we covered a fair amount last time, but one thing I had mentioned but I didn't actually do anything with is sort of a shelter system. So having it so that if there's a certain type of object, that if the snow comes in contact with that object, likely a foreground object, but obviously it would depend on whatever game you're making, the snowflakes would um, will appear to be destroyed. They would no longer fall past that object. Um, so we can start just by creating. Um, this is just going to be a placeholder sprite for your game. That's let's say I'll call it boundary, and it's going to be just. I'm going to have it just be a blue block, just a blue square, and I'm going to make a new object called obj underscore shelter. Actually, no. See, I'm already doing something I should probably never do. I've called the sprite boundary, but I've called the object shelter. And that will certainly get confusing if at some later point I decide to expand this and I want, subcategories of boundaries or shelters or whatever. So let's name these the same thing, and I like shelter better. So I'm going to call that one shelter, and then go back and rename this one uh, sprite shelter as well. And that's just a good habit to get into to make sure that everything's staying consistent, and that later on, if you need to, when this becomes much more complex, I can show you another project some other time that I'm working on where I've become somewhat overwhelmed with just the sheer amount of objects and sprites and things to keep track of. And this will make it much easier. But that's kind of an aside. So we will give that object the sprite shelter. And I'm just going to go into the room and place a few of these shelter objects. Let's say just like this. And what I want is when the snow starts falling, if it comes into contact with just the top of this here, or really the side of this, that the snowflakes will not fall past it. They will appear to vanish, kind of giving the illusion that whatever this platform is, it's giving shelter from the snowflakes. So obviously if we were to run it right now, really nothing would happen. There is no code in this new object. It is the engine is not recognizing it at all. You can see the snowflakes are going behind this, and I believe that's because this automatically has a depth of 1 or 0 rather. And if you recall, the snowflakes have a depth of 1 because that's what we assign to them. But that's kind of a good thing, and we'll see why later. And right now, it looks like the snowflakes are just going behind this object, and they're clearly falling right through it and moving on their merry way. So what we're going to do is take a look at the snowflake behavior. And there's a million different ways you could code your own collision events, or you could program them right into step. But you can also just use, for something this simple and imprecise, we don't need, there's no like real complicated physics that we're simulating here. We're just checking, hey, did it bump into the shelter object? So we can actually use the built-in collision with shelter. And now, you might be tempted to, in this code, just say, well, I think it's instance destroy, and you could just say self, and that would be that. What's this new? Yeah, execute event flag. I think that's an optional argument. But if we were to do this, let's see if that works. We have a big problem, because while the code is working and it's destroying the snowflakes as they come into contact with this object, remember that our snow controller is not constantly checking to see how many snowflakes are in the room. We could do that, but the way we have things set up, the snow controller is just spawning 200 snowflakes and letting them go. the snowflake object itself is taking care of what to do next. And as you can see, if we're deleting these snowflakes when they come into contact with this thing, the illusion that we made before is rapidly disappearing. We see that, oh, there's really not that many snowflakes. They are destroyed by this, and each time one is destroyed, we have fewer and fewer and fewer snowflakes. And then it starts to look kind of sad and pathetic. So instead of destroying them, all we're going to do is really just use the same logic we use as if they were going outside the room. So let's just copy and paste the outside room code right here. Okay, and just like that, this shelter is working. So if a snowflake falls on top or on either side, then it will be deleted. And hopefully we can see one come from the right side. Yep, and there it's deleted. Everything on top's deleted. And up to the left, it's all being deleted and being instantly kind of respawned at the top of the screen. And anything that doesn't come into contact with that, it can still fall underneath it, which is what we want. I mean, that's how a shelter would work in real life too. You could still have things coming in from the side. If you really wanted to completely cover this, you could have more shelter objects here or here, or wherever you want to place them. But this, for what we wanted to achieve, this works. But you may have noticed one very small issue with this. And this is something that is really nitpicky, because you might be taking a look at this and saying, well, at this resolution and for what the project is we're doing, this looks fine. I don't really see a problem with this. And if you were to ask the average person, they wouldn't really be able to tell you what's wrong with this picture, because there's really not anything that overtly wrong with it. But remember, in the last video I talked about the kind of top-heavy issue. We already had a bit of an issue with this system as we've created it, having more snowflakes at the top of the screen than at the bottom. And this shelter object is just making that problem worse, because every couple seconds you can see 5, 6, 7, 8 snowflakes are being prematurely respawned from kind of the middle of the room right back to the top, and they don't have a chance to fall all the way off the screen. So if you were to just take a look at this kind of second half of the screen, you would notice that the density of snowflake population is a lot less than up at the top of the screen. So let's just kind of think through this problem and try to come up with a solution. So think about this. When the snowflakes are coming into contact with this object here, what we're having happen right now is they're being sent right back up to the top of the screen. But what we could do is try to figure out how long it would take that snowflake to fall all the way down the rest of the screen, and then come back up at the top. And we don't really have to come up with some kind of crazy calculation of how to do that. One really easy thing we could just do is make it so that when the snowflakes collide with this object, they become invisible. And then when they go outside the room, they become visible again when our respawn code runs. So let's give that a shot. So here, instead of saying, okay, on collision with object shelter, respawn at the top of the screen as if it were outside the room, let's do this instead. Let's have a draw event and go back to create and set up a new variable here called isVisible. And we're going to set it to true. So when a new snowflake is spawned, it is visible. And all we're going to do here in create is if is visible is true, draw self. Or rather, let's be consistent with our other code where we were using ID. We'll do draw ID. But that's really just saying, hey, if this variable is set to true, just draw yourself like you normally would. And then else, don't do anything. Because the interesting thing about draw is, before we were using a kind of default draw function. We didn't have this draw event, so GameMaker was saying, okay, I will use my standard draw event, which basically just means however you have the object moving around or whatever in the room, that's fine, but I will draw the sprite that you have set. But as soon as you take over and you have your own draw function, GameMaker is going to pretty much take everything sort of literally. It says, okay, you clearly want to have some kind of unique draw function, so we won't assume anything. If you don't have like draw ID like here, nothing's going to happen. It won't even draw its own sprite. So now that we have that set up, let's go back to collision with object shelter. And all we're going to do here is set that value that we created back over here is visible to false. More or less creating a switch to switch on and off whether the object will be drawn. So it will still exist, it will still be falling right through the shelter, and it will still be falling right off the screen, but it will be invisible while it does that. So let's go back to outside room. So now try to imagine this. Let's say there's a snowflake coming down here, it hits the shelter and it becomes invisible. So it's not respawning back up the top, it's still falling down, and it'll eventually go outside the room, which will trigger the outside room code to run. So we go back to outside room, and we're going to do one more thing. Before we go back to the top of the screen, set is visible to true, so that if this was already true, in the case of a snowflake that didn't hit this shelter, it wouldn't change anything. It would still say, okay, it was true, and now it's still true. And it goes right back to the top of the screen at a random X location, and that's that. But if it fell down through the shelter and visible became false, it would turn that back to true before it respawned at the top of the screen, so that it once again becomes visible as it begins to fall down the screen. And then again, if it bypasses the shelter, it will continue to be visible. If it hits the shelter, it will become invisible until it goes outside the room again. So I think that's everything we need as we have it set up here. But you never know with these things until you test it and run it. And maybe I've forgotten something as I've been trying to explain this, but let's see what it looks like. Oops, we've got an error here. So unknown function or script draw. And that's right, isn't it? Let's see. Draw. Here we go. See, this is a function that just says draw yourself. This is the function that I meant to type the first time. I wasn't paying attention, and I was, I think, more or less declaring a function that didn't exist because I never set one. So that was the error there. This is the function called drawSelf. If you need to see the documentation, you middle click that, and GameMaker will provide you very good documentation of what that does. So let's save that and see if it works now. Okay, and so far, when the snowflakes are colliding with this, they are just instantly turning invisible. And if we did everything correct with the code, then when they come back, they should be turning visible again. And we can tell from our test earlier when we had just the objects being deleted here, and they were becoming more and more sparse by the second, that we're not having that same problem now. We can tell that the objects are being set back to visible properly when they come back to the top of the screen, because we're not seeing that dwindling population of snowflakes like we were seeing in the other video. And this helps even out the problem that we were having earlier too, with the top heavy snow on the top and the lack of snow on the bottom. Now it looks a lot more even, as all the snowflakes that are caught here are only becoming invisible and staying off the screen until they reach that bottom of the screen. They're not instantly being respawned only from halfway down the screen. So that's kind of a probably a much more complicated, lengthy tutorial that frankly, the video is probably way longer than it needs to be, but I like to over-explain things rather than under-explain things. And I'm always very open to people asking questions if anything I said doesn't make sense, or you just have a question about something that I've done here. I know as I'm just kind of chattering away as I do these things, everything makes sense in my head, but it might not make sense to you, so please don't hesitate to leave a comment if you have any issues or you just need help with something.